It began with one sermon clip, just a single moment, a few bewildering seconds captured on camera, that detonated across the internet with the force of a cultural earthquake, a moment so chaotic, so wildly off script, that critics, comedians, church bloggers, and social media reactors instantly crowned Jamal Bryant with a title he never imagined would cling to him: America's most misguided preacher. But the truth, the deeper truth, the truth buried beneath years of polished suits, viral videos, and thunderous applause, is that this clip wasn't an isolated mistake or a sudden lapse. It was simply the loudest spark in a long trail of smaller fires he had been accidentally lighting for years. Because behind the pulpit lights and charismatic delivery, behind the headlines that made him trend and the controversies that made him infamous, lies a pattern that has left millions wondering how a man with so much talent, intellect, and influence became the punchline of his own ministry. And trust me, what you're about to hear goes far beyond that one viral moment. This story spirals into deeper territory, into the tension between performance and purpose, between ambition and misjudgment, between the preacher Jamal Bryant wanted to be and the meme the internet decided he had become. For years, Bryant existed in a strange limbo where praise and ridicule lived side by side, where some admirers called him brilliant, electric, revolutionary, while others dismissed him as reckless, theatrical, addicted to shock value, a man more captivated by applause than accountability. Yet no matter which side people landed on, everyone agreed on one thing: whenever Jamal Bryant stepped onto a stage, something unpredictable was guaranteed to happen. And lately, that unpredictability has reached a level no one could ignore. Clips began flooding social media, sermon analogies that made no biblical sense, scriptures twisted into confusing shapes, statements so bizarre that TikTok reactors paused mid-video trying to make sense of them. Podcasts dissected his every word with surgical precision, influencers joked about him, commenters asked repeatedly, is he serious, or is he trolling the entire church on purpose? But the confusion, the mockery, the head-shaking moments were just the surface of a much larger story. Today, we're diving into the moments that turned Jamal Bryant into a national talking point, and in some circles, a running joke. We're exploring the sermons that made congregations shift uncomfortably in their seats, the decisions that even longtime supporters couldn't defend, and the controversies that made critics whisper a shocking label he never expected to wear. Because what shaped Jamal Bryant's public image isn't just what he said, it's what those words revealed about a deeper and more complicated struggle. And just when you think you've heard everything, just when you feel like you understand the unique storm that surrounds him, the story pivots into territory that will make you question how a preacher with this much influence still holds a microphone. But before the memes, before the misquoted scriptures and the internet comedy, Jamal Bryant was seen as something entirely different. Long before the chaos, he was hailed as one of the most promising young leaders in modern ministry. A sharp, articulate, media-trained communicator whose confidence filled entire sanctuaries with ease. Older pastors admired him for commanding a room with the swagger of a seasoned veteran. Younger audiences gravitated toward his energy, his rhythm, his unapologetic flair. For a brief moment, it looked like he was destined for legendary status within the black church, the kind of preacher whose name would be mentioned alongside historic giants. But here's the part people forget. Jamal Bryant stepped into ministry carrying the weight of expectations, the pressure of legacy, and the deep hunger of a man who always felt he had something to prove. Raised around activism, intellect, and public scrutiny, he learned early that attention was currency, and the louder the message, the bigger the crowd. That mindset followed him into the pulpit. By the time he gained national visibility, Bryant wasn't just preaching, he was performing. Every sermon was a full production. Every point was delivered with pacing, rhythm, and emotional theatrics. Every message came wrapped in entertainment, cadence, and drama. And for a while, it worked spectacularly. Churches invited him not just for wisdom, but for the excitement he brought. Social media embraced him. His statements turned into sound bites, and his sermons into shareable moments. Crowds multiplied. His influence exploded. But here's the problem with popularity. It demands more, and the same charisma that lifted him up began to raise uncomfortable questions. Was he preaching for transformation or performing for reactions? Was he being prophetic or provocative? Was the message growing stronger or getting drowned by theatrics? Slowly, cracks appeared. One awkward sermon clip turned into another. One strange analogy became a trend. People who once applauded his boldness began replaying his words with disbelief, wondering whether he truly understood the gravity of what he was saying, or whether he was simply chasing viral attention under the banner of ministry. And then came the moment, the clip that made critics lean forward, supporters look away, and the internet ask in unison, "What was that?" A clip so confusing, so bizarre that millions saw it before his own church members did. And this defining explosion didn't erupt from some special event or controversial conference. No, this came from a completely ordinary Sunday morning. The sanctuary was full, cameras were rolling, and Jamal Bryant stepped to the pulpit with the same confidence he always carried, unaware that within minutes he would ignite a firestorm that would permanently reshape the way the world saw him. He walked onto that stage like he always did, confident, animated, pacing with the controlled swagger of a performer who knows exactly how to command a crowd. And for a few moments, everything looked normal. Everything sounded familiar. Everything felt like the same Jamal Bryant people had watched for years. He gestured, he riffed, he built momentum like a seasoned entertainer warming up an arena. But then, right when the energy peaked, he delivered a statement so bizarre, so tangled in its own confusion, that the entire room froze in a stunned silence where no one, absolutely no one, knew whether they were supposed to clap, laugh, or quietly pray. He clarified himself. And online, clarification never arrived. Within hours, that tiny, baffling clip blasted through TikTok, X, and YouTube with a force that even Bryant couldn't outrun. Commentators reacted instantly, making faces of disbelief. Meme pages turned it into a joke. Before the service had even ended, people who had never heard his name before were suddenly spending entire threads debating what he meant. Some viewers shrugged it off as a slip of the tongue. Others said it was proof of something deeper, a preacher who seemed more invested in theatrics than theological depth. It wasn't just another funny moment from a charismatic pastor. It was a spark that ignited a wildfire of criticism across the digital world. TikTok reactors paused mid-video to replay the line, podcasts analyzed it frame by frame, and gospel commentators, people who normally give pastors the benefit of the doubt, couldn't figure out how a man with such a massive influence could speak so carelessly without stopping to think. Even some of his longtime church members admitted publicly that they didn't know how to defend him this time. Viewers replayed the clip again and again, searching for context, clarity, anything that could turn nonsense into sense. But the more they tried to decode it, the more confused they became. For the first time, Jamal Bryant wasn't trending for a message that stirred souls, but for a message so perplexing people assumed it had to be satire. And once the internet got a taste of the viral energy surrounding him, it didn't stop. Old clips resurfaced, one after another, strange analogies, questionable metaphors, half-thought comments where the performance devoured the meaning. Soon it felt like every week a new clip of him saying something outlandish was circulating across platforms. Critics pointed out a pattern. He wasn't just being theatrical. He was stumbling into statements that made him look reckless, unfocused, and dangerously unaware of his own influence. The title, America's Most Misguided Preacher, didn't appear from nowhere. It was created by viewers who genuinely felt he was no longer leading with clarity, but with chaos. And this was the true turning point, because once people start laughing at a preacher instead of listening to him, everything changes. Respect becomes shaky. Credibility becomes delicate. And while Bryant brushed off the criticism publicly, insiders privately acknowledged something undeniable. This viral clip had permanently shifted how millions saw him. But the real unraveling, the part of the story people didn't see coming, had nothing to do with that clip alone. What came next wasn't a single embarrassing moment. It was a cascading chain reaction that exposed deeper cracks in his ministry, his reputation, and even his personal decision-making. And once those cracks appeared under the internet's magnifying glass, everything accelerated. Because the moment Bryant was thrown back into mainstream attention, the internet did what it always does. It went digging. Old headlines resurfaced. Past interviews reappeared. Previous controversies, once buried in old blog posts and quietly whispered church conversations, suddenly had millions of new eyes dissecting them. And the more viewers looked, the more the conversation shifted from, "That clip was weird," to "How did this man get here?" To understand why the backlash hit so hard, you have to understand something crucial. Jamal Bryant's ministry has never been free from turbulence. From the earliest days of his public life, he carried both admiration and scandal like twin shadows following him everywhere he went. To some he was bold, brave, and unapologetically outspoken. To others he was impulsive, inconsistent, and too enamored with attention. And when the internet spotlight returned, those old fractures didn't just reappear. They exploded. One of the biggest criticisms that resurfaced was his long-standing pattern of drawing massive attention to himself through dramatic, emotionally charged statements that didn't always align with thoughtful leadership. Critics argued he often rushed into cultural commentary without weighing the impact of his words. Supporters struggled to defend sermons that seemed crafted more for entertainment than enlightenment. Reaction channels produced hour-long videos analyzing his decisions. Podcasts debated whether he was more performer than pastor. Comments sections turned into battlegrounds where former fans, confused observers, and longtime critics collided. And then came the resurfacing of his past personal dramas, the ones that had trailed behind him for years. Some stories were exaggerated by the internet, but many came directly from public records, earlier interviews, and widely discussed incidents that had already shaped his reputation long before this viral moment. People began asking hard questions. Why are his controversies louder than his accomplishments? Why does chaos follow him into every season? Why is he always trending for something wild instead of something meaningful? This wasn't simple criticism anymore. It was a full-scale re-evaluation of who Jamal Bryant was. On the pulpit, behind the scenes, and in the public eye. And the deeper the internet dug, the more the conversation shifted from humor to concern. Because the story wasn't just about a preacher who said something strange. It was about a preacher whose entire image began to crumble under the weight of his own unpredictability. Through all the backlash, all the memes, all the commentary dissecting his every syllable, Jamal Bryant kept preaching with the same theatrical rhythm, the same combustible passion, the same dramatic cadence that had defined his pulpit presence for years. And this consistency, depending on who you asked, either made him look like a man of unshakable resilience or a leader completely unaware of how deeply the controversies were eroding his credibility. That was the moment when critics began labeling him with a word he never saw coming. Not controversial, not unpredictable, but unprepared, a term that cut sharper than any joke because it accused him of reacting impulsively, speaking without filter, and prioritizing the theatrics of ministry over the solemn responsibility of leadership. Memes multiplied. Parody videos flooded timelines. The phrase "America's most misguided preacher" spread so far beyond church circles that even people with no interest in faith-based content were repeating it as if it were his official title. But the real twist, the moment that truly began his unraveling, was still lurking ahead. It came when Jamal Bryant made a bold, dramatic, almost theatrical public announcement that he believed would make him look modern, relevant, and in tune with younger audiences. A statement he assumed would electrify the room and draw applause. Instead, it detonated the internet. Within minutes, the clip was clipped, shared, reposted, and replayed on TikTok, X, Instagram, and YouTube reaction channels. Influencers paused mid-video with their mouths hanging open. Gospel commentators buried their faces in their hands. Even people who had defended him through previous controversies finally stepped back and admitted, "Okay, this is too much." Commentators roasted the decision. Religious analysts questioned his direction. Secular creators mocked the attempt at trendiness. Some said he was desperately trying to appeal to a generation he no longer understood. Others claimed he had run out of thoughtful ideas and resorted to pure shock tactics. A huge portion of viewers admitted they felt secondhand embarrassment watching it unfold. Memes flooded TikTok. X exploded with hot takes. Gospel bloggers replayed the moment frame by frame, pointing out the stunned faces in his own congregation, the raised eyebrows, the awkward chuckles, the stiff body language of people who didn't know whether to say amen or silently pray the moment would end. It didn't just spark conversation, it instantly reshaped his reputation. But what made it significantly worse was how Bryant handled the backlash. Instead of acknowledging the criticism, clarifying his intent, or even expressing humility, he doubled down, brushing everything off as noise, insisting the public had misunderstood him. To some, this looked like confidence. To many others, it looked like detachment, an alarming disconnect from how out of control the narrative had become. And that's when the internet built a new label around him, one even harsher than before. Jamal Bryant wasn't just unpredictable, he was out of touch. Commentators argued he valued attention more than accuracy, reactions more than responsibility, and spectacle more than substance. Faith influencers questioned how a preacher with such historical potential could repeatedly undermine his own legacy. Reaction channels posted videos titled, "What Was Jamal Bryant Thinking?" that racked up millions of views. Comment sections buzzed with people saying they couldn't tell whether he was preaching or performing, whether they were listening to a pastor or watching an entertainer gone viral for the wrong reasons. And slowly, the tone shifted from humor to exhaustion. The jokes weren't funny anymore. People were no longer laughing at the clips. They were concerned. They wanted to know how a minister with such education, influence, and charisma could continuously walk into situations that made the nation shake its head. But the moment that truly shifted everything, the moment that made viewers go from mildly amused to deeply alarmed, didn't come from a sermon at all. It happened immediately after one of his most controversial statements. Cameras were still rolling, microphones were still live, and Bryant said something off script, something unplanned, something revealing, something that exposed a deeper issue than a poorly phrased analogy or a misguided attempt at cultural relevance. The room went quiet. The air grew heavy. Even his biggest supporters couldn't pretend they didn't hear it. Because what came out of his mouth wasn't just awkward, it was telling in a way that made millions stop and ask a question far more serious than, "What did he just say?" They began asking, is Jamal Bryant losing control of his message? Or was he never fully in control to begin with? And this moment, this accidental, unfiltered comment, didn't stay inside the church walls. It spilled into public forums, leadership debates, radio shows, national commentary, and conversations that reached far beyond his congregation. The backlash was no longer centered on a confusing sermon or a viral slip. It had grown into a deeper, more complex confrontation with his leadership, his influence, his judgment, and his unraveling public image.